All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Bernie Kipp. We're at Stoel Rives' office in Portland. It's November 22nd, 2019. Thanks so much for joining us today, Bernie. I really appreciate this.
Sure.
So let's start off with how did you get into the career you're in and started working with the wine industry?
Well, I tell people this story, and it's, I'm not particularly proud of it, but I went to a state college in California. I was a liberal arts major, and decided to, after I graduated, was looking for a job, and somebody suggests, well, you can take what they call the Federal Service Entrance Exam. It was kind of the standard application test that you took for any federal job at that time. They kind of consolidated it. And part of it, you took the test, but then you would say, okay, well, depending on how you do on this test, which agencies do you want to see this? And what it was, now this was 1969, yeah, 69. And it was a 8.5 by 11 piece of paper with like 5 columns on it, very small type. And it was every federal agency that was using this test. So I thought, well, I swear this is true. The first column was alphabetical. I went down the list and I saw alcohol, tobacco, firearms. I thought, well, that sounds kind of interesting. So I checked that and a few others. And a little while later they called and said, well, you did really well on this test. You want us to send your information to this agency? And they did. And then they called me and said, okay, all right, you want to go to work with us. At the time, I was living in Southern California. My wife and I got married in December, and she wanted to get out of LA, so did I, so we moved, and one of the openings was in San Jose. Mm-hmm. So I came up there. Actually, I had to go to San Francisco for the interview, and then they said, well, we have openings in San Francisco, which includes Napa, Sonoma, we have down in San Jose. So I said, all right, San Jose. So I went to work with alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. At that time it was called, actually it was part of the Internal Revenue Service, okay? It didn't split off until ATF as a separate agency until 1972. Okay, so anyway, I went to the office in San Jose, and they pretty much, did oversight. Government. IRS is a taxing agency, so it was involved with the excise taxes on alcohol. There were some fairly large distilleries in that area at the time, a lot of really small wineries, a couple of major breweries in that area. And that's kind of what the job was. You went and you would do what they called inspections at these places, basically revenue audits, now what they call product integrity, where you verify. So I got a pretty good feel for the California wine industry, not from the Napa side, but more the area down around Monterey, Morgan Hill, Gilroy, that area. So I got a pretty good exposure to that. And so I did that from 1969 till 1976, at which time I transferred up to Portland. And that's how I came to be involved. And the area in Portland, this is where I kind of got my feet wet. And when I came to Oregon, it's the same job, but the most popular winery in Oregon when I came here in 1976 was Honeywood Winery. And it was pretty much fruit and berry stuff. And the guys I worked with were kind of, the work that they did with these kind of wineries was, there's a lot of sugar and water added to stuff, so it wasn't so much, label as far as, and I brought some experience that these local guys didn't have. I mean, they didn't know anything about, vinifera grapes, and because they just, they didn't make that kind of wine here. And they had, Hood River Distillers, they had Blitz Weinhardt, they had Rainier Brewery, some pretty big size ones, and some other, over in Eastern Washington, some pretty good, like fruit companies. But this is where I kind of started out on the right foot here, because I could sense that there was two main groups in the Oregon industry, wine industry. There was the Honeywood guys and others that I can't even remember their name now. And then there was the group that was pushing for the vinifera wine. And these guys, all basically had side jobs or real jobs, and this wine stuff was just something they did on the side. And it took every hour and every penny that they had. I'm sure you've heard about this, but what I found mostly is that these guys were they were very hard workers, they were very pioneers, but they hated government regulation and they hated paperwork because it just was a burden to them. And I remember the first couple times, I think it was Dick Evrath, was having trouble doing his annual report. And he said, I just can't make any sense out of this. And I'm tired of wasting time. I want to go ride on my tractor and work on my winery. I just hate this stuff. And I could sense from talking to him that he had had previous discussions with ATF people long before me that didn't understand what he was talking about. So he would say things, and they would say, he got very frustrated because they weren't answering his questions, and he said, I don't know if I'm asking the right questions, but I just don't want to spend any more time on this. But I keep getting these nasty letters that I'm not filing this, I didn't do that. So he kind of struck a relationship with me because he sensed that I understood his questions, and that was big to him. The other guy that I really initially found was Bill Fuller, and he was out in Tualatin Vineyards. He had come from the Napa Valley, so he was well steeped in this, and he knew that ATF at the time didn't really know what they were doing as far as regulating this. I mean, they just didn't. And so I got to be friendly with Bill, and he sensed that as long as there was an effort of somebody trying to, understand what was going on, he appreciated that. So another guy that was very much like that was Ron Volstead. And Ron had done so much work with amateur winemakers. He was just, at the Washington County Fair, everybody in there was working with Ron so he was very generous with his time. And he was one of the wineries that was transitioning away from the berry stuff into the vinifera stuff. And I mean, those two guys, Bill Fuller and Ron Volstead, don't get near the credit that they should, because they were just really pulling the industry along. But then, I met people like Dick Ponzi. I met people like, like I say, Erath. David Lett was another one who hated this paperwork stuff. He just didn't. And he could get a little, ornery about stuff. But if he sensed that you were trying to meet him at least halfway, he was really good to work with. And he was, as far as the Pinot, he was the real pioneer on that. Richard Summers, I knew a little bit, but again, he was another one that if he sensed that you were, not just going to be a bureaucrat and read regulations to him, he was, a little different, but those guys, were the ones, and they thought, okay, at least this guy understands what we're asking, and maybe they can help us with this. Because if you start giving them regulations about how much sugar and water you could add to this fruit, it's like they just got really tired of that. But I thought those guys were, like I said, if they sensed that you were trying to work with them, and they were okay. And what I remember, I had some good training in California, and the guys that I worked with said, now look, there's two ways to do this. You can just read the regulations and tell them that, or you can try to learn something about the industry. And so I was really encouraged to take classes and to find out about this, because it'll really help you if they have a sense that you've got some credibility, as opposed to somebody that's just, the old bureaucrat. So that was the initial group that we ran into. The next second wave that we ran into was people like David Adelsheim. And that guy he was, not only was a really good winemaker, he had a real knack for dealing with the bureaucracy. And he knew how to kind kind of weave his way through things. He did all the viticultural applications. He did all the, basically wrote the Oregon wine regulations. He would talk to me for hours about the federal wine regulations and how they could merge. That guy is just amazing. I mean, like I said, the wine he makes is really good too, but he was just invaluable as far as navigating this bureaucracy. So, and he was another one that if you sense that, you made an effort to kind of meet him halfway, then he was pretty good to work with. And I know I used to, he would send in petitions he helped the Umpqua people, sorts of Willamette Valley people, the Rogue people. He basically was kind of the ghostwriter for most of that stuff and said, this is what you got to show and this is what you have to do. And I remember clearly, again, TTB was, at that time it was ATF, was dealing with this. And they had been mandated by a court because a consumer group took them to court to say, your labeling laws are just fraud. I mean, when somebody says they have a Napa Cabernet or Napa Chardonnay, if you read the regulations, basically 24% of that wine is from the named variety and the named place. I mean, that's just fraud that you're allowing people to call it that. So TTB, it was a consumer group, California, that took him to court, and the judge said, no, these regulations are misleading. You need to rewrite them. And so they came up with a stricter thing to where it is now. Still not as strict as Oregon because Dave Adelsheim wrote that. But they did that, and they said, okay, and then they came up with this concept of ABA. And again, it was kind of blending what they do in Europe versus they do here, and it just really didn't fit right, but they tried to make it work. And David was one that said, okay, that's a good idea that we can show that this is a delimited grape growing region, it's got a unique characters to it. And he sent it in, and I think the thing that David sent in went from Eugene up to Portland. And TTB kind of came back and said, well, that's an awful large area. That's not really what we were thinking, more of a, like they do in, France or something. And I remember talking to David, and they sent it back to me and said, well, go talk to him and see if you can get him to cut this down a little bit. Because if we start basically making half of a state, then that ruins the whole concept. And I remember him telling me, he said, well, we can change it. But he said, if they want to change it, then they're not playing by their own rules. I went right down the list of stuff that they said, this is what you need to show. And he said, they just want to be arbitrary and say that it's too big or whatever. And I went back to him and I said, well, if you're going to argue with this guy, you better come prepared because he did what you said. And then the next one they sent out was the Columbia Valley, which was huge. I mean, it jumped borders but again, and that wasn't him, that was somebody else. But I said, hey, look, these guys did what you said to do. So anyway, there was that. But there was still one guy who was still in the fruit and berry realm. And he was on the Oregon coast out of Nehalem Bay. And this guy's name was Pat McCoy, and he was just a delightful character. He was straight out of he was an ex-disc jockey. And he bought this really nice location on the beach down there on the coast. And his goal was to have a tasting room, where people would come by and enjoy the coast and stop in and have some of his wine. I mean, his stuff, God love him. He was a fine fellow, but he was not a good winemaker. And Adelsheim and Erath and other people said, look, here's the problem. When people buy Oregon wine, any Oregon wine, that's what they think of Oregon wine. So you had this core group that was trying to develop their image and get a quality product, and this whole thing with Pinots was coming out. And he said, the worst thing that can happen is that somebody goes to the coast and buys some of his stuff, and then they think that's Oregon wine, and it just undercuts our whole thing. And this is one of my favorite stories about Pat, because like I said, he was just a huge man, and funny and clever. And he used to sword fight with us over these regulations, like, you guys have to take responsibility for giving a disc jockey a winery permit. You can't just blame me. But anyway, he said, I'm trying to do what I can here, and the whole thing it's a tourist destination place. But he said, every time Sunset Magazine runs an article about Oregon wine, I get 10 people showing up here at our tasting room asking, where's Dick Erath? Where's Dick Ponzi, where's, David Adelsheim? And I said, so what do you tell him? And he says, I tell him he's not here right now. What kind of wine do you want? I mean, that's what but it got to the point, I think, and I heard this from several people, that they went to him and said, look, we can't have you selling this stuff as Oregon wine, and we'll make your wine for you, and you can put your label on it, but we can't have you putting this stuff out. Because he was making stuff like cranberry wine and strawberry. I mean, it was all this stuff that at one point, was Oregon wine. Mm-hmm. So, but his trouble was that he'd get these fruits with really high acid, and they had all kinds of rules about how much sugar and water you can add. And of course, he'd go to the limit, and they'd say, well, that's still terrible. I mean, so he'd just keep adding sugar and water. But yeah, Pat was a real character. And like I said, his deal was, tasting room on the coast. So anyway, but that's kind of what happened with these guys. Bill Blosser was another one that started his place, and these guys were all kind of in the same category. They were making kind of fine varietals, but mainly the Pinots. And it was people like David Lett and Dave Adelsheim, and Erath was another one, that those guys really kind of bootstrapped the thing, So, and Bill Fuller, he was another one that he made one of the products that I thought was really liked from him was his Riesling, And he would deal, because he came from Napa, he knew the whole deal, he knew how it worked, and he knew what it would take. So, anyway, those were the guys that I kind of started with. Now that was in the, like I said, mid-70s all the way through 80s. And then I remember Jim Bruno did his thing down in Willamette Valley. And he built a showplace winery, still is. I mean, it's just, but he was another one that had a real skill at dealing with legislatures and things like that. And those guys, I mean, they pushed this thing and said, we are not going to get caught up in, like they are in California. We are going to make this a pure thing, very much like they do in France. And he didn't want certain varieties named. He didn't want Chablis and Burgundy named. He was really adamant about that. And then the other thing was the percentages. And again, his skill was really good. And the OLCC, the Liquor Control Commission, would get questions from people about, all right, now this rule says this, but this one says that. And they would just refer people to Adelsheim because he's the one that wrote them. And he said, that's the way it is, So he was really good on that. And again, back to Pat, when we were, one of the things he would get in trouble. I don't think there was a section in the regulations he didn't violate, But he said, the trouble with these guys running this Oregon wine industry, they put up in what he called schoolboy rules. And he said, it's going to make it very hard to sell this product nationwide. I mean, you might sell a lot in the Willamette Valley or Portland, but if you're trying to sell wine in New York or New Orleans or Texas or whatever, you're competing with people that don't have these rigid standards. And I think he was a pretty good marketer. He knew that. But Alcide says, well, that's exactly why we don't want to allow that, because it's going to diminish the, the reputation. So it was pretty much, like I said, I don't know how many they're up to now, but that whole group in there was kind of in the same, they were all kind of, like in Dundee, there's a few of them in Salem, and then over out in Washington County, but that whole corridor in there was kind of all doing the same thing. And like I said, I mean, these guys were doing what they could. They were trying to cover the waterfront with, developing their winery, and they didn't have, they weren't selling that much wine. And they just felt this burden of all this paperwork and labels and all that. They just got very frustrated with it. So that's, I've kind of worked with them, and the guys that I worked with, there was two other guys in Portland. One was Ron Fitzgerald, and the other one was Bob Pimpelli. We kind of helped each other, and they kind of felt the same way. You don't have to be an adversary. As much as you can, you work with people. So, and again, I would tell our supervisors, that's a big part of what our group has. They have a big distillery in Hood River, which had been there for a long, long time, and Blitz was still going at the time. But so much of our permittee base was these wineries and small wineries. Like I said, Honeywood had a lot of volume, but these guys, and their whole thing was the label. That's gives us our reputation. So we would work with them, and the new guys would keep coming in and so forth. And every once in a while, you would get somebody that was got a new marketing technique, and they were going to, let the investors decide how the wine should be made. And I got Bob McRitchie was a fellow that worked at Sokol Blosser. He was just an excellent winemaker, but he could not stand that meddling and interfering, because I remember once when we were down and giving a class in Arizona to the industry down there, and we were going through the whole thing about the labels and all that. And one guy came up to me later and he says, "Listen, this is all interesting, but what I do is sell sweet wine to old people. That's what I do. That's what they want." Okay, he said, they come through our tours of Mexico, they come up through this border, and they stop at the winery. He said, "I make wine out in concrete tanks, and I bottle in a little bottle so they can put it and take it with them on the bus." He said, "That's what they want, and all this other stuff is meaningless to them." And I said, "Well, okay, but you've got to cover the whole range." And he goes, "Yeah, I understand that, but that's not my thing. I don't do this." So there were still a few people like that, but most of them were in the realm of trying to do something special.
So tell me a little bit about, you mentioned especially Dave Adelsheim and learning the lessons of California's labeling issues and striving to be. So tell me a little bit about what makes Oregon labeling special and made it special at that time. What were those regulations?
Well, the first ones were the percentages. Like I said, when I first started this, and before they got sued, the federal labeling regulation said if you're going to name a variety, like Cabernet or Pinot or Riesling or whatever, it had to have a minimum of 51% of that variety, which meant 49% of the volume could be something else. And then there was this appellation issue, and David and his group said, well, if it says Oregon wine, it's got to come from Oregon. It can't be made, anyplace else. And that's what's problematic, trying to explain this to people with the wine labeling versus the distillery labeling. If it says Oregon or any of these sub-appellations, it's got to come, I think the latest was 85%, the federal. Oregon's like 100%. They didn't want any of that. And there was certain varieties that they, Pinot Grigio was one. Pinot Grigio is not grown in Oregon. So if you have Pinot Gris, that's fine. But Burgundy, Chablis, trying to think of some others.
Champagne.
Yeah, well, yeah. Champagne, Oregon, it's sparkling wine. And I think they were just very adamant that this is going to be pure, and we're going to place our bet on the image of Oregon wine. And he, like I said, was pretty good at writing regulations and getting them through the legislature. And he and I used to talk all the time about, okay, well, that's fine, we do this in Oregon, but he said, if you read your federal regulations, it says, in order to do this or make this statement, it not only has to be truthful, it has to be in compliance with the state law. And he used to always get frustrated with, he said, how can you guys approve this stuff? Because it clearly is in violation. So somebody in Oregon could get a label approval for Pinot Grigio or Burgundy or Chablis. And he kept saying, you shouldn't be allowing that because it says right here that you have to be in compliance with the state. So we used to go back, and like I said, he would work on name varieties. There was a big regulation on that. So yeah, that was the thing. It was, and that's where Pat with his Schoolboy Rules, this group that was really adamant, and of course vinifera grape, and they pretty much adopted what those Oregon guys wrote. So, yeah.
Was there other significant pushback from the state outside of that kind of core group? Were there people in Oregon pushing back against those?
Not at that time, because like I said, it was pretty much fruit and berry guys and then this hardcore group of vinifera. But as things went on, and this was much, much later, as these ABAs, I mean, the first ones that came out were, like I said, Willamette, Rogue, Umpqua, And then we started coming up with these subcategories, Chehalem Mountain and Ribbon Ridge, and Dundee Hills and all that. And I remember Barney Watson, who was just a fine guy and a really smart guy that knew a lot about wine. I asked Barney about it because, again, you come up with this criteria that they lay out, that it has to be, known by this name, it has to have a history, it has to have unique soils or whatever. And Barney kind of poo-pooed the whole thing, and he said, that's a marketing thing. But he said, that's all Willamette Valley. He said, they're starting to say, well, these soils are different and that. He said, okay, I mean, if you want to do that, but as far as real difference, he just didn't see it. But again, trying to think of the fellow's name that was working with David on these, because they sent in like 6 of these things at the same time. And now, God, I mean, Yamhill, Carlton, and I think from what I understand, they're sending even more.
Yeah.
And Washington's doing the same thing. And what it turns out is that, okay, these are marketing techniques. I mean, you can say, well, this wine is from Yamhill, Carlton, this is from Ribbon Ridge, these are really distinct. Okay, maybe they are, maybe they're not. But then you had the umbrella of but the point you were asking, the guys down in Southern Oregon started getting involved. And gosh, I wish I could remember the guy's name that was at the college down there. I mean, Earl something. He came up with the Applegate, the subcategories down there, and he said,
Porter Lombard?
No, not Porter Lombard. This was.
He came in there.
This guy was a professor. I want to say Jones.
Yeah, Earl Jones?
Yeah, Earl.
Okay, there's Earl.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he said, well, we have to do something because we make wines totally different than they do in the Willamette Valley. Our reds are much stronger and they come in earlier and all that, and a lot of the varieties that do well there don't do well here and vice versa. So he said the problem is when I go to New York or basically east of Portland or Oregon, when you say Oregon wine, they think Willamette Valley. So we've got to do something to establish our identity in Southern Oregon. So they have a group down there that's really strong. I think Scott Henry was involved with that at the time. But anyway, so they were saying, look, we don't want to just be lumped in with Willamette Valley because our wines are different. So we want some of our own identity, and they do. I mean, they did that. I don't know that they really pushed back, but I think, again, this was not my thing, but the industry said, look, we got to do something to promote ourselves. So they taxed themselves, and they did some other things with the grape tax that helped form this marketing board to get a push outside the state. And now, I mean, you can go to any major city in the country and nice restaurant in there will have Oregon wines, and not just, Irie or Sokol, Blosser. I mean, they'll have a lot of the smaller ones. I was in Louisville a couple years ago, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, there was like, I thought I was in some restaurant in Seattle or Portland. I mean, all these wines they had, So that's the only kind of pushback that I got on that part of it. Now, we'll talk about this later, but there, with the recent developments and the people coming into Oregon and trying to co-opt the stuff. But anyway, I just remember, and I can't remember who said it, but when I was talking with Adelsheim and his group about this, and they said, well, whoever it was that said this, is that what we're trying to do is keep the fast buck artists out of the Oregon wine industry. The people that are just going to come in and capitalize and use it as a marketing term. So that's what.
So when you first came into Oregon, mid 1970s, you had barely any industry at all. Obviously, a very, very small Oregon wine industry, some fruit and berry, very, very small group of core vinifera growers. Tell me about watching it grow, sort of somewhat because of these labeling regulations and for other reasons as well. Tell me about watching it grow and when you started to feel like it actually was an industry with a bright future.
Well, I think what really helped them is they would go to these blind tastings, and they would routinely wipe out California, and I think the one that they really bragged about was they wiped out a bunch of French wines. And they just made good wine. I mean, now they had to really work at it, I guess, and again, I'm not a winemaker, but it was just a lot of hard work, and they they would do that and go to these competitions and win awards. And the guy I work for now it's kind of a side business, and he said, that's what propels everything. If you get some really good press about from a wine writer or a competition, then that's what people do. So they started doing really well in these competitions. And I can remember once going to a restaurant here in Portland, because we also did a lot of trade practice stuff about legal ways of selling stuff. And they were talking about this one particular restaurant in Portland, and they said, well, that guy is really different. I mean, he basically decides how much profit he made that week, and then he'll buy the wines that he thinks he can afford. And he'll buy like 1 bottle of this and 2 bottles of that, and that's what he did. So he wasn't buying cases of anything, because and that way he thought it gave him a chance to, help out the industry itself and get into new wines. I remember one time, it was the guy's name, I think it was Barney Smith, I think his name is. He was a winery down there in Southern Oregon. And he was, again, this was a side gig for him, but he was a real purist. And we were trying to do something at the time, ATF was trying to do something to get a kind of a fingerprint of what they would say, this is what an Oregon wine would look like, like they do with liquor. And he said, who thought of that idea? And I said, well, they're just trying to help the industry, because one of the main laws that they have to enforce is the Federal Alcohol Administration Act. And that law, has all this revenue protection and all this consumer protection that, a wine that says this has to have this much, and they're looking for counterfeit because, it can be very expensive. And he said, well, that might work with whiskey or gin or something, but it's not going to work with fruit because these grapes are all different. I mean, even though they're the same variety, a grape grown here is different than that grape grown here, and the style of the winemaker and all that, if it, whole cluster or whatever. So anyway, I said, all right, Barney, I get that, but I mean, do you want to help out with this? And he said, well, what do I have to do? And I said, well, the government will buy it from you, but we need like a case of your wine that we can run these samples on. He said, oh, there's no way I could give you a case of wine. He said that I would be denying 8 or 9 of my customers. And he said, I can't do that, So I said, okay, well then, can you give us one? He goes, and I think he finally, but his idea was that you can't, I mean, it was that limited. People were buying bottles at a time, so it was difficult,
So in your kind of early days in Oregon, for first 10 years or so, take me through kind of like what a normal day or week would look like for you. What exactly were you traveling to all these wineries? What were you doing?
Yeah, I mean the area that I came to from California, I was talking with one of the guys. He's a fellow investigator named Dave Dunbar. Is one of the smartest guys I've ever met. But he was working here, and we were talking one day about, areas that you had to cover. And I said, we had to cover from San Jose all the way down to San Luis Obispo. And he goes, yeah, well, okay. He said, what we do here is we cover Oregon, Washington, Montana, Idaho, he said, so Alaska, Hawaii. So yeah, your little group here, doesn't really match up. But he would tell me that what would happen, and again, this is the way it worked, but a lot of the work was in Oregon and in like the I-5 corridor. But you had stuff in eastern Washington, some larger fruit things, but Walla Walla was really not much at the time. Red Mountain and all that, Yakima Valley. I mean, they had stuff over there, but it really wasn't. And then St. Michel built their place, and then the place over in eastern Washington. But to your question, I mean, we would, our supervisor, my supervisor was in Seattle, and he'd say, all right, look, we need to go do these, we need to do some inspections here, but we try to match it with somebody. At that time, you'd field visit when you went into business. So he said, if I got some guy starting over in eastern Washington, I'm going to match that with 3 or 4 things that we can, But, so there was some travel, but like I said, the main emphasis for the new wineries was kind of in the Willamette Valley area, and then Salem picked up. And then you had to match that all around, you're doing your revenue audits at places like Hood River and others. But somebody would come in, and they'd say, well, we bought this property and we're trying to get some bank financing. Because when you go through this with both the state and the feds, they want to know how much money you've invested and where did it come from. Because it was, the straight or post-prohibition thinking. They were keeping the organized crime out and all that stuff. So there was a lot of that. And that's how I knew that these guys were really strapped financially. I mean, they were doing everything they could just to keep it going. So, but is it, kind of picked up. And what I found from the Oregon wine industry was a real camaraderie. They were willing to help each other, kind of for this greater goal kind of thing. And they really do that. I mean, their industry was like that. But we would get people, I remember Bill Blosser, who was, I think he's an engineer. I mean, he really is buttoned up on stuff. And he was coming in and going through the whole thing and showing it. And, he said, well, this is what we're going to do. And, it may not look like much at the start, but, we have big plans. And, I mean, look what's happened with him. So there was a lot of that. There was a lot of people just, doing what they could to get started. I remember my boss was an older fellow, just a really nice guy, but he was kind of on the old school, and he'd see all this stuff going on, and I'd say, well, his name was Walt Kite, and I'd say, Walt, we had these 3 guys come in here, and they're all talking about starting a winery, and he goes, all right, now look. He said, let's be sure that they're past the daydreaming stage here, okay? I mean, have they got any money? Have they got a place, Because he said, we can't just be spending time with these people if they're not going to, So I said, oh, okay, but so that's what a lot of that,
So tell me about how your job evolved as the industry was growing. Clearly, by the end of the 80s and into the 1990s, you're all of a sudden you have an industry with hundreds of wineries. So tell me about how your job evolved and sort of what it became over the years.
Okay, what happened with this, and again, this gets back to this business of trying to learn something about the industry. What would happen is that I would become kind of an unofficial liaison to people in Bureau headquarters and regulations branch and some of the other branches back there that would write rules, labeling. And because I knew the industry a little bit, they would come to me and say, well, look, what about this? They want to do this. Is this a good idea? Can they do it? And I'd say, well, this is what they want to do. Now we have to see if it can fit, So that's kind of how that went. I mean, I ended up talking to some people about regulations. And for example, one thing I can really remember was a guy named Harvey Schaefer, who I don't know if you ever heard that name, but he's just a fine fella. He had a winery over in Forest Grove, Schaefer Vineyards. And he was another one that, I would go to these guys and talk to them about technical stuff. And they'd say, well, you got to do this, you got to do that. And then they'd come to me, and he was the one that said, I have to send in a tax return to you guys every 2 weeks. He said, look, IRS lets me file once a year. And I pay them a lot more money than I pay you guys. So what's the problem with this? And so I said, all right, Harvey, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll write a petition, and it'll be mixed in with a whole bunch of other stuff. But for a winery tax below this level, you should be able to file once a year. And they approved that, you know. So I would tell that industry people that. I said, you know, you guys come up with these ideas, we'll try to get them in the pipeline. But there was that, the AVA thing, they kind of came to, you know, they needed somebody in the field that could go out and talk to these guys. I'm trying to think, a lot of the stuff with this fruit and berry stuff, like I said, there were certain fruits that you just couldn't make wine from unless you could really add a lot of sugar and water. So we got some of that changed too. And again, there was a massive rewrite of the regulations. Part of it was because, like in the early 80s, late 70s, part of it was implementing the court decision, but others just, you know, I know Nancy Ponzi used to argue with me all the time about, look, we're small people. We you know, we don't have unlimited time or money. I mean, these regulations seem really burdensome. Can't we do something about consolidating them or reducing them? And the push and pull of that was, okay, but on the other hand, you guys, people over here that want those regulations because they uphold the integrity of the label. So if people just, like I said, the fast buck artists, you know, they just want to put something on there and run, then that undercuts your thing. And again, it was difficult because, you know, what I used to tell guys, and when I was the district director, I would train them, and I'd say, look, this is what you have to do, and this is what you have to have the wine guy. You go into the tasting room, and you grab a bottle of whatever it is, and it's sitting there labeled and ready to go. I said, now you show me all the way back through bottling, storage, fermentation, and crush that you can support what it says on this label, okay? And if you can't do that, then I can't do it, and that label's not entitled to be on this wine. And I was like, oh my, you know, well, because all these Oregon wines, you know, had all these embellishments. They had vintage date, they had appellations, they had, some of them would have, but the variety, they would talk about how it was made and fermented in small batches or whatever, whole cluster fermentation. I said, you had to have records to prove all that, you know, and of course a lot of them, well, we know how we did it. And I said, yeah, but that doesn't count. So you would run into that. And, but it was burdensome. It really, and like I said, most of these guys had a side job or a real job that they were trying to make this work. So that's where that was.
You had kind of an interesting role as you were kind of, like you say, a liaison, like you were.
Well, that's the way, I mean, and then towards the end of my career, before I got to be district director, I actually worked in regulations branch. And at that time, they were letting me work from, I didn't have to move to DC, but I went back there a lot. But yeah, and again, I think this speaks well to the agency. And again, you got to remember what ATF was going through at that time. I mean, they were guns and bombs, you know, the agents that doing their thing. And we were kind of this side issue over here. Used to really annoy me, but that's the way it was. And the answer was, Congress gives the money to the agencies and they tell them what they want them to do. Okay, so the main thing was they were into law enforcement with, you know, gun sales and storage of explosives and bombings and all that. So this other stuff was kind of a, you know, okay, yeah, there's a group of people that find that interesting, but, you know. So they would work on it. And again, the agency would say, look, we need to be, you know, have some credibility here when we go talk to these guys and say why you can't do this and why you can't do that. Because you'd end up arguing with people like Adelsheim and other good attorneys that would say, here's your regulation, so why aren't you enforcing it? So, yeah, I did that, and that was fortunate for me and my bosses. They kind of let me do that as opposed to, because a lot of other guys were out going to gun dealers and they were going to explosive magazines and, you know, but, you know, so there was that. And that's how I got to know a lot of these guys. And I over the years, I would do we used to do a lot of what they called wine seminars, kind of educational efforts where we would, and I would argue, said, listen, you can sit there and kind of like a hawk on a fence and waiting for somebody to do something wrong and then jump on them, or you could have these outreach things where we'd go through the regulations with them and give them examples of what records should look like. And those are very popular. We did them in California. We did them all through the Northwest. And people really liked that kind of stuff because a lot of the people, as they got larger, they would hire staff that was responsible for all this stuff. And the turnover was really high in that. I mean, somebody would learn it and then they'd go on to something else, So that was a good thing. And I think they tried to start back with that. Again, things change, there was a big emphasis on online learning and all that stuff. So I just always felt that those seminars were beneficial. And we had a counterpart that the microbrewery, everything I told you about the wine was on that side too, except those guys were far more edgy. I mean, they were willing to do stuff that they probably shouldn't have. But it was the same kind of thing. It started small, Portland and Seattle with all those. So, yeah, there was that too.
Tell me how you have a pretty unique perspective, having seen distilleries, wineries, breweries. Tell me how you view the wine industry compared to those. What is similar about wine versus those two? What is different?
Well, what is unique about all of them is that initially, when I started, and most of the people at ATF I knew, when you talked about a brewery, you were talking about Budweiser or Miller. You talked about a winery, you were talking about Gallo. You talk about a distillery, you were talking about all those guys in Kentucky, and we had Hood River. They were all big. Okay, so we had some folks with the distillery part of it, they would start making unique small batch products, brandies in particular. Steve McCarthy that had Clear Creek Distillers, he was the one that would make these small batches. And he had a friend of his in California that was doing the same thing. And he said to me, or that guy told him, ATF doesn't understand their own rules. They're going to tell you can't do this. They're going to think if you're going to be a distillery that they will expect Hood River. And somebody making stuff in a small building and small batches, they don't know how to handle that. And he said, you just have to tell them it's like baking a batch of cookies. Instead of making 50 of them, you're making 5. So you have to cut everything back. And so there was that. And the same thing with the brewery thing. I mean, Widmer, as far as I know, started in their garage, So there's a lot of similarities into these unique batch things. So, and again, they got the same amount of paperwork. And one of the things that Bill Fuller and I talked about, and he was the one way back when. And I said, Bill, the problem with this, and I can see the industry's chafing at this, is that whether you like it or not, when you go into the wine business, the government's your partner. And they want a lot of what to say. And he said, most of the people, resist that. They don't need a partner. They don't want, somebody telling them how to make their wine or, what they can, But he said, yeah, well, that's true. I mean, and so there was this resistance, like I said, because to them, they didn't think that was helping their wine effort at all, but it sure was taking a lot of their resources. And the same thing with the breweries and the distilleries. So, yeah, there's a lot of that. And I think there's also a lot of collaboration between these people, Portland's, I don't know how many little distilleries they have now, but over in Southeast, I mean, they've got 6 or 7 maybe, So, but the biggest problem that I see for the industry now is because there's so much outside influence, so people coming in, buying up wineries, buying up property, and they're coming over the top. A lot of them are coming from Europe, where they're not used to this kind of regulation. What I find more and more with small wineries, especially now, is the only way they can survive. And I mean the only way is through wine clubs and direct-to-consumer. It's so hard to get into these retail chains. You know, it just, you go in there and, you know, and the retail people, again, I've talked to a lot of them and they say, look, you know, I have 7 or 8 Pinot Noirs out there. I don't need that. I mean, I could do 2, but I don't know which 2. See, that's the problem. And it's just so hard with shelf space. So the guy told me, look, he said, this retail chain said, look, what we are basically landlords. You know, we lease out our space to vendors. And our whole idea is getting stuff to ring at the cash register. We don't want to be involved in ordering it, stocking it, pricing it. The only involvement we want is when somebody gives us something and we run it through the cash register. That's what we do. That's the only way this business model works. So they want all the effort back onto the vendor. Okay? So that's very difficult. And again, one of the buyers at one of these large chains told me once, he said, listen, if I wanted to, I'd have a parade of people all day long coming through here telling me why I should do this. I don't have time for that. So, you know, I pretty much, you know, we do a lot of scan data information and what sells and what doesn't and what's our profit margin. But he said, so if some little guy coming in here said, you know, I make really good wine, and I'm like, okay, but I don't have any place to put it. So it's just really hard. And I think Doyle Hinman was the one that told me, he was the guy down in
Eugene?
What was the name of his winery?
It was
Hinman Vineyards, yeah, okay. He told me, he said, listen, he was just a really friendly guy, and he said, when I started this, you know, I knew it was going to be a lot of work. And he said, it's farming, growing the grapes. But he says, there's dealing with you guys, there's dealing with the state, there's dealing with the county, there's dealing with OSHA. And then we've got weather that we have to deal with and try to get glass and try to, you know, get tanks. And because a lot of these guys, like Adelsheim, would get a load of oak barrels from France and all. But he said all of that was as difficult as it was, dealing with the weather and all that. He said it paled in comparison to trying to get a bottle on the shelf. He said that was the hardest of all because there was just this resistance. And he said, I just try to tell these guys this, that you can make the best product you want, but it's trying to get it in for sale. So a lot of them have defaulted to this, all right, we'll have a tasting room and we'll have direct-to-consumer, which is an animal unto itself because the states, you don't want to regulate, they don't want stuff coming over the top. The wholesaler groups don't want that. They want, you know, to control. So what I find most of the Oregon wineries and Washington, these small guys starting out, unless they have a whole lot of money back, somebody, they have to go this direct-to-consumer and tasting room thing and then hope that that catches on and builds some momentum. But it's hard. I mean, and you know, there's so much competition and the money, you know. The other thing, I used to talk to a lot of the industry guys and they'd say, well, okay, but we have a price point that we have to sell and we're getting squeezed by these big retailers that, you know, they will keep cutting the price and pretty soon we're not making any money at all. We're making some wine, but, you know, so it's hard. It really is.
So I'm assuming in this career you had that you had at some point some people try to put something over on you or pull a fast one on you. Without naming any names, I'm curious if you could remember any interesting incidents of someone trying to pull something on you.
I can tell you the one that before I came up here even. There was a winery in California that, you know, what happened in California is that they, you know, have varieties that were popular. Some of these old vines, you know, I think the last I heard it was like 5 years to have an actual producing vineyard, so from the time you plant it to the time you can use the fruit. Well, the industry changed and they would put in, you know, people started liking this variety as opposed to that. Well, that variety isn't available. I mean, you know, or to very limited. And I remember this particular winery was buying stuff, but they didn't have enough of this particular variety. And they would buy stuff over from the Central Valley, and we kind of got the idea that this guy was providing the paperwork that I told you about, and he was basically falsifying it, saying it was this variety than that variety. And he was just really sloppy and clumsy at it. I mean, it was easy to see it. So this other fellow and I were doing this, and they said, well, we have to go over to Central Valley and talk to this grower. And I went to see the guy, and I said, okay, and first of all, he was kind of like, who are you and what do you want? Because he was a grower. He wasn't, and he had a huge German Shepherd, I remember, that was his buddy there. So I said, well, look, we want to talk to you about some fruit that you sold to this guy. And he goes, okay. And I said, well, what did you do? And he said, well, I think he wanted some of this and some of that, and we sold him that. And I said, okay, so that's what you sold him. He said, yeah. And I said, okay, so that's what he asked for and that's what you sold him. He goes, yes. So I said, okay. He said, well, what's the problem? And I said, well, he says it was that, not this. And the guy looked at me and looked at his dog, and he said, well, then he owes me more money. So I said, well, no, that's not what I want. And it was hard, but he ended up giving me a statement that no, he said that, yeah, you've got the invoices there, and that's what we'll go with. And he goes, but boy, and then he kept thinking, did I just get swindled here or something? But I think he was willing to say whatever he had to as long as he gets some more money out of it. But that was one that was a problem. So, yeah, I mean, there was that kind of stuff. And I think ATF had a major case in I forget when it was now, but that grape fraud, they had a major thing. I didn't work on that. I knew the people that did, and that was a big deal. And it's the varieties that, we used to kind of joke about this. One time we were at a training class down in Atlanta, Georgia, and they had some kind of, wood sales thing going on in the same hotel we were at. And they were talking about it, and this whole business was people would buy this kind of wood and sell it. And so they were talking to these retailers, and the guy said, well, now here's your problem. You've got you've got cherry and you've got maple, but what the people want is oak. So what do you do? And he says, well, you get some oak stain and plenty of it.
Make it oak.
Yeah, that's kind of what. And sometimes they tried that in the wine business. And that's where people like David Adelsheim and his group were really purist about that. But that doesn't mean that it didn't happen,
Sure. So obviously, as Oregon wine has grown in popularity and in profit, it has had some issues with outside influences in the later years, and obviously some notable incidents. So tell me about your view of and involvement in some of the more recent Oregon wine cases here.
Yeah, I don't do anything with it now, but Jim Bruno came to me when this latest dust up that they're having with the folks in California, and his point to me was, isn't what they're doing illegal? I mean, what do your regulations say about that? And I would say, well, Jim, you pointed out some things. Some of these labels are clearly misleading. They shouldn't have been approved. Others could be, and it's the idea of where the fruit came from. Some of it is, you guys may not like it, but it doesn't mean it's illegal. So it was all over the lot. And this is where you were asking about the unanimity in the industry. The Jim Bruno group, who was very involved with the state legislature, was pushing for some stricter regulations. The folks in Southern Oregon are saying, no, wait a minute. Now you're going to kill the whole Oregon brand with this stuff. I mean, that's great for you, but he said, we're down here, and we sell a lot of fruit and wine to other people, and, they should be able to say that if it's made, So there is that, because it's all, how is it going to affect them financially? So, yeah, as you see people, like say, trying to basically come in and pirate the Oregon name, there's a lot of pushback against that to make sure that, because, if you get something out there that says Oregon and it really isn't, or it really isn't what the state wants, you're back to Pat McCoy with his deal. So there is that, and there's so much money at stake here. I mean, you're dealing with somebody that has got a really strong marketing arm that can, do a very good job of selling wine. And again, I was very much on the periphery of this. I did some stuff for Jim, and I talked to some people, and a couple of newspaper articles, and I think the San Francisco Chronicle. But I'd say, look, I mean, the guy's trying to do what he can do. You can't hate him for that. I mean, he's trying to sell wine, but Jim Bruno felt very strongly that this was, basically gotta say, pirating the name. And he's very effective at getting the state to pass these rules. So that's where the things like, I haven't talked to David about this for years, but he would say, okay, ATF, TTB, you can't be approving these labels for people if they're doing this, because the state says, and I did. That was one thing that I did talk to. I still have a lot of contacts back there and the labeling folks, and I said, you guys, there's a hurricane coming here. I mean, this is going to land right in your lap because you've approved some labels that probably you shouldn't have, and you're going to have to rescind some others. And he said, there's going to be a lot of, some of the, Congress people, senators, are very interested in this. So again, they're like, oh, geez, we have to. One of the things I used to always tell people that they just didn't understand this. When you send in your label for approval, the only thing TTB can do is look at the four corners of the label and say, all right, does the mandatory information, is it in the right place? Is it the right size? Is it, is there anything contradictory about it? So it can only be approved to form because that's what they have no way of knowing if that label it gets put on the right bottle. Mm-hmm. That's where the field has to come in. And I would say to guys to try to explain that, and I'd say, all right, are you sending a perfectly fine label for Pinot Noir? But it doesn't work. You put it on a bottle of Chardonnay. And he said, well, we wouldn't do that. And I said, okay, but you're arguing why did this label get approved and I should be able to use it. You can use it if it fits. And that's where a lot of this subtext about the appellation and when can you use these AVAs and so forth. And there was some labels rescinded. So, yeah.
What has changed the most about Oregon wine since you became a part of it? Besides just pure size, obviously it's grown. What else about Oregon wine industry has changed the most in your?
Again, I think it's transitioned from these small guys that did this on the side business. Mm-hmm. There's just a lot of California money that has come in, a lot of European money, because these guys see something good and they want to be part of it. Mm-hmm. But the business model that Ereth and Ponzi and Bill Fuller and those guys when they started, Dave Lett, you don't see that much anymore. First of all, because the land is too expensive. A lot of the land got bought up by the California wineries, and I remember a couple of people telling me, in the old days, the vineyard production changes from year to year depending on the climate. We get bumper crop here, and we get this and there, and you could always kind of supplement your vineyards if you had to by buying fruit from somebody else. He said, not anymore. All that fruit is tied up in long-term contracts. And so it's just very hard to get additional fruit, price of the land, and the other thing is the industry is really saturated now. Somebody, I'm going to go in business and make Pinot Noir. Geez, I wonder why nobody else thought of that, So there is that. They've kind of reached the point. And that's why I think the people that want to keep that standard high, that's what they've got, kind of the purest part of it. So.
What do you see as you look ahead for the industry? What does the next decade look like?
Well, again, I'm not an economist. I just know when I talk to my boss here, who's very much involved with, helping a winery get started from all the way from financing to land acquisition to, he thinks a lot of them are kind of in trouble. They have a lot of wine to sell, and nobody really to sell it to, and it's just a function of the economics, So, You still get people that want to come in, but like I said, the little guy that's got 3 acres or something and wants to. I mean, he could do that and get the paperwork and all that, but now what? And a lot of it's just hobby stuff. People that nobody's making any money at it. Others that are just really good, hard-working people have just found out there's too many people doing the same thing. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if there's going to be kind of a thinning. That happened in the brewing industry. A lot of the microbreweries just went out of business. So many of them are tied to pubs, and what they're finding is the pubs, people don't want just the greasy hamburger anymore. They want this kind of high-end thing, and a lot of them have just closed their pubs. So I don't know how it's going to go. I mean, I think it's very hard to start something new and be successful at it. I think there's a lot of people making 5 or 10,000 cases a year, and it's like, okay, now what? The guys that do well are the ones that have a good product and they sell everything through their wine club or their direct to consumer. Those guys at least are not underwater at this point. But again, like the buyer told me, I have 10 Pinots, I don't need 11. I don't need 10, So tell me which ones I can get rid of. So I think that's just the reality.
Are there other, do you anticipate more issues like Jim Bruno's issue? Do you anticipate more of that happening in the future?
It could. Again, it would have to be something that, that really kind of gets to the core of the brand. But there's always stuff coming up. I mean, like they had in Europe, with the France, the scandal they had a few years ago. When you have something and there's not enough of it and people want it, that kind of creates the situation, But that thing in France, I mean, that was one of the main premier regions, and people thought that would never happen. Well, it did, So, I mean, there is stuff that kind of gets outside of TTB. You kind of get into FDA stuff. You get into this resveratrol where people are, I mean, California has the big thing about the labeling issue, and it gets into potential health issues and things like that. So there's all these outside factors that come into play that can really land on somebody that So there could be that kind of stuff. I mean, people are looking for ways to maybe get into the pockets of the industry. But I mean, there's FDA. They regulate stuff, organic claims, allergens. I mean, TTB's been fooling around with that now for when I was there. This idea of allergen labeling, and the industry really resists that because they're going to end up looking like a can of fruit cocktail or something with all the stuff they have to put on there. But there's another side that says, hey, this is a real thing, these labeling allergens, So this stuff is difficult. Yeah.
So as you look back over with your involvement with Oregon Wine, what are you proudest of? What is? I think what I was proudest of was that I was able to kind of get in and be accepted as more than just a bureaucrat, somebody that was willing to work with them. And like I said, I demanded that of the investigators that I had at the end. I said, you guys, you're going to have to know something about this industry. It's going to require you to do some of your own research and study. But I don't want you going in there and making a fool out of yourself by saying something stupid. And because they'll sense that, and they'll say, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And you're in there trying to tell him to do something that he didn't want to do, and he, first of all, discounts you. So, I mean, that I think was the collaborative effort. And believe me, there's a lot of people in government regulations that one of my favorite bosses told me that he didn't like the idea of these seminars. He said, we're not here to entertain people, we're here to regulate them. I don't care if they like us or not. They probably shouldn't like us. And I say, you just can't do that. I mean, these people, this is not these, he was from the Midwest, and he said, this is not Jim Beam and Jack Daniels and, these, it's different than that. And
And he thought, all this labeling and checking, and he said, that's either people like it or they don't. But he kind of came around to the end and said, okay, this is our group here, so this is what we have to deal with. And he was helpful on that. He would allow us to do the seminars, but I think that was the main thing. It's just that we kind of came across as maybe somebody who was willing to work with you as opposed to just regulate you, So I think that pretty much.
And so you're still not officially involved in the industry, but still kind of
yeah, I worked with Stoel Rives,
okay.
and they hired me right after I left TTB because they had been dealing with me, with representing their clients, and stuff would come up, and they said, you seem to still have a pretty good relationship with the industry, and you also seem to have some friends still in the government. And I said, yeah, because I don't ask them for favors, I don't try to take advantage, but I understand that, they need people to work with. So he said, well, look, if you come to work with us, you can still do a lot of that. He said, a lot of this stuff we don't know, and we don't want to spend time learning it. It's cost the client a lot of money, and if we kind of cut through all that. So that's what I did that now 11 years. So, yeah. And it's good. I still know a lot of the people from when I knew him in the government. In fact, Steve Volstead, who works out at Saki One now, is Ron's son, and he called me the other day, and we were talking about old times. So, yeah. So that's good. It's kind of worked out for Stoel Rives because like I said, they don't have to waste a lot of time looking stuff up.
They hired the expertise.
Yeah.
So tell me about if it were 1976, you're taking your job again right now in 2019. What's different about coming into TTB now as opposed to when you got started here in Oregon?
Well, again, as I said, the way the regulatory agencies work, Congress gives them their money, and in TTB, especially the last 3-4 years. They are getting monies from Congress with dedicated purpose, okay? And we're not just going to give you a bunch of money and then you decide, because they have an operating plan and they have, mission statements and all that stuff, and there is protect the revenue, there is protect the consumer. But within that, there's a lot of leeway, and a couple years ago, a perfect example is when the government shut down, and all these, people were running stories and CNN and everything about, well, what does this mean practical to the consumer? And here's some brewer in St. Louis or something say, well, I can't get out my holiday beer because TTB is shut down, they won't approve my label. So look at this is terrible. So right after that, Congress said, okay, here's what's going to happen. We're going to give you some extra monies, and you're going to clean up this label approval process, and it's going to be done within a certain time. And if you don't do that, you're not going to get any more money for that. We're going to take that away. So they did. They gave them some money, and they had to go hire a whole staff of people to, set the backlog, because at that time you'd send a label in there and wait for months to get it approved. And then, of course, if you try to sell it without that, now you're running a risk. So there was that, and then the other one, the most recent example, was some dedicated funds for business practices. What you can do to get your product sold, the relationship between the retailer and the wholesaler, or the retailer and the producer. Congress heard enough complaints and said, all right, you guys go clean this up. This whole thing about slotting fees and how you get into supermarkets and what could be sold. And so they've spent the last couple of years really going after that. So when you do that, the agency, and this is what I was telling the San Francisco Chronicle, the agency has 60 field investigators for 50 states, okay? So they were saying, well, don't they go out and do these product integrity inspections? And I said, okay, 60 guys for 50 states. They may do some, but it's usually complaint driven. So I think the only big difference now is that Congress is saying, this is your money and this is what you're going to spend it on. And that can change from, so before that, we didn't have that. I mean, you would get your budget and then the agency would decide how to allocate it. But now, Congress wants more say, and and if you don't do what they say, then you don't get the money. So that's kind of the way that works, So I think you now, coming in now, I mean, the investigators, again, the field guys, they're going to be told this is what I used to have to do an operating plan where we would sit there and say, all right, we're planning on doing this many of this kind of inspection, this many of that, and I had 9 states. So, I'd send somebody to Utah and they'd be there a month. I'd send somebody to Montana. I'd send somebody to Hawaii. But you had to do all this within the budget. And sometimes they'd come and say, well, that's what your budget was, but now there's been this rescission, so now this is what you have. So, yeah.
Sure, absolutely. Well, that's all the questions that I have for you today. I really appreciate this. Is there anything I should have asked that anything we didn't cover?
No, I think you pretty well got it.
All right.
And I didn't give up too many names.
No, you did great. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time today, for your answers, for interviewing with us, and we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
Okay.